Hey guys, June here, and in this video we're going to talk about the absolute basics of dealing good DPS with magic. Our three main objectives of this video are going to be to set up a bar that works well with Revolution, whether or not you choose to use it, to understand how our abilities function so we know when and how to use them, and to take a zoomed out look at our ability rotation so that we can set up some guidelines that make it easier to improvise an ability rotation in an actual combat situation. Let's get started by taking a look at some example ability bars, and the only thing that's really important about the order of abilities on these bars is if we're using Revolution, the order of our basic abilities is important because Revolution always prioritizes to the left. This also means that if strictly using Revolution, there are different circumstances where you'd want to have different abilities in a higher priority space, which is why there are some blank slots on that action bar, and we'll cover that in a little more depth shortly. Interestingly enough, our very first pair of abilities are the only abilities that are different for two-handed and dual-wield magic. For our dual-wield choice, we have Concentrated Blast, and if you've watched the Melee DPS Basics video, this is effectively a magic version of the ability Fury. It's a channeled ability, which means that doing things like moving or switching weapons while using this ability breaks the channeling process and causes it to deal significantly less damage. Concentrated Blast also provides a critical hit chance bonus to the next ability used, which means that dual-wield magic is a little bit higher average damage than two-handed magic when used against enemies that you have 100% hit chance against. Because of this buff, we also want to orient our ability rotation so that whenever possible, Concentrated Blast is coming before a high damaging ability like a Threshold ability so that we get the most out of that buff, and because of Concentrated Blast's short cooldown, we can use it every third ability, and we'll see a beautiful pattern with this develop later on when we take a look at a longer rotation. Finally, the last concern with this ability is arguably the most important part of dealing good DPS when using dual-wield magic, and that's that this ability is very weak if channeled fully. Not only does it reduce your overall adrenaline gain, but it deals less average damage when used this way. Instead, our objective is literally to cancel this ability as rapidly as possible by activating whatever ability we plan to use after it. This causes only 2 of the 3 hits of Concentrated Blast to actually connect with the enemy, however it cuts down the time required to actually use the ability by nearly half and so increases its average damage as a result. Doing this is absolutely vital for dealing good DPS with dual-wield magic, and if you're new to it I would recommend heading to Dummies and just practicing for a few minutes to get the hang of it. That brings us to the two-handed variant of this ability, which is Sonic Wave. It deals the same average damage as Concentrated Blast when we cancel it appropriately, and it has the same cooldown. Instead of the crit bonus from Concentrated Blast, it gets a 6% hit chance bonus to the next ability used, which makes two-handed magic significantly better damage against enemies with high defense. The real beauty of Sonic Wave, however, is in its simplicity. Because it's not a channeled ability, we don't have to worry about canceling it prematurely, or we don't have to worry about breaking it by moving or doing any kind of weapon switches. For this reason, two-handed magic is often significantly more comfortable to actually use, especially when you're using Revolution because you eliminate the need to have to cancel one of your basics with a manual input. Because of this, I usually recommend people use two-handed magic when doing things like Revolution AFK Slayer, or for high-level bosses where you're concerned that having to move due to boss mechanics is going to break Concentrated Blast frequently and decrease your DPS. Our next basic ability, Dragon Breath, is a nice simple one that hits the primary target as well as any target standing in front of the player when this ability is used. It deals wonderfully high damage on its own, however it can also receive boosted damage as well as an occasional damage over time effect if you're wearing the Dragon Rider amulet from the One-of-a-Kind quest. The combination of these two effects adds an average of about 17% ability damage for each use of Dragon Breath, which isn't quite strong enough to make it worth using over another amulet like an Amulet of Souls or a Reaper necklace, which can contribute much more to your overall DPS. However, if you're looking to get sweaty, you can swap to the Dragon Rider amulet exclusively to use Dragon Breath and then swap back to your primary amulet. This brings us to our next great basic ability, Corruption Blast, which needs to be unlocked by using a Mazcap ability codex, which has a pretty long-term stable price of about 12 mil on the GE. It is absolutely worth that price, however, and once unlocked constitutes a very large portion of your Magic DPS. Like all damage over time abilities, there are several different attributes of Corruption Blast that we need to keep in mind when using it. The first is obviously that it takes several seconds for Corruption Blast's damage to fully connect with the enemy, however it's unique in that it weights its damage more heavily towards the earlier hits and each hit gets progressively weaker. This means that in situations where the enemy might die before the effect expires and we wouldn't want to use other damage over time abilities that wouldn't do worthwhile damage before that point, it is still worth using Corruption Blast. Additionally, like all damage over time abilities, multiple players using the same ability will cancel each other's effects. This means the higher number of people on your team using magic, the more likely someone else is going to use Corruption Blast and cancel your effect before the full amount of damage goes through. Normally this would discourage us from using this or other damage over time abilities in a large group where there are several people who are using the same attack style. However, because of the fact that Corruption Blast has that extra weighted damage towards the front, it's likely that the vast majority of the damage will still go through even if it's cancelled prematurely, so it's still worth using. On top of this, like most other damage over time abilities, it isn't affected by many types of boosts. For example, with Magic, it doesn't receive boosted damage from the Sunshine ultimate that we'll talk about shortly, however it deals such high base damage that it's still worth using as part of your Sunshine rotation regardless. Finally, the last interesting attribute about this ability is that the effect can be passed between enemies, and so it works as kind of an impromptu area of effect damage as well. This makes it wonderful damage against groups of enemies, and there are even some limited scenarios where this ability gets absolutely insane, like when farming kill count for God Wars Dungeon 2. So, in short summary, Corruption Blast doesn't suffer from most of the shortcomings that other damage over time abilities do. It's always worth using, even if you're in a large group with other people using the same style as you, even on low HP enemies, and even as part of a Sunshine rotation. Our next basic ability, Combust, is a much more conventional version of a damage over time ability. Because it takes several seconds for the damage to go through, it's generally not worth using on low HP mobs, or if you're in a very large group where other people will be cancelling this effect by using Combust themselves, it's generally not worth using as well. It's also not affected by most types of boosts, just like other damage over time abilities, so we're generally going to try to leave it out of our Sunshine rotation unless we're able to move our enemy, in which case this ability does double damage once that enemy is moved, and it's definitely still worthwhile using in Sunshine. If you're in a situation where Combust loses its value, either because you have to compete with other mages on your team for that bleed effect, or because the enemy HP is too low to get the full effect from it, you can simply eliminate it from your rotation and replace it with one of the variable choices that we'll talk about shortly. These 4 basic abilities represent our high damage basics with Magic, and generally our goal is going to be to maximize our use of these 4 and minimize our use of the other basic abilities that we'll need to fill out our rotation. That brings us to filling our remaining slots with some of our weaker basic choices, and which ones we decide we want to use highly depends on the circumstances under which we're fighting. The first of these basic abilities is Impact, which deals an average of 60% of your ability damage and has a 1.2 second stun, which is pretty much useless. What can make this ability worthwhile is the Flanking perk, which increases its average damage up to 132% with Flanking 3. At that level of damage, it either meets or exceeds most of the high damage basics we talked about earlier and is a great part of a rotation. The 3 drawbacks here are first that you have to be on the side or behind an enemy to use flanking at all, so it's only usable in team encounters. It's also a reasonably high effort method because you want to simultaneously benefit from your normal perks as well as your flanking perks, so it's most common for flanking to be on a switch weapon to use exclusively for this one ability and then to switch back. This also makes it very costly because not only do you have to spend the money to break down cannon parts to get components for making the Flanking 3 perk itself, but you also have to afford the weapon switch that it goes on. With Dual Wield, you can circumvent part of this cost by using the offhand magic item from player-owned ports, however when you're using a two-handed staff you'll have to have a completely separate staff to use as a flanking switch. If you can get past those drawbacks, however, this is a very large increase to your average damage overall, and is definitely worth employing at any kind of group encounter. The second of our ability choices here is the ability Chain, which is another ability with a base average damage of 60% ability damage. The benefit with this ability is it can hit up to 3 different targets, and as long as the ability hits 2 or more targets, its average damage is competitive with the high damage basics we talked about earlier. The Corroming perk is also available to increase the number of targets that this ability is able to hit up to 6, or a total of 360% average damage. However, there are rarely circumstances where there are enough enemies within range to use this effect. It also suffers from the same drawbacks as having a flanking switch, since you would want to have a Corroming switch so that you can benefit from your primary perks as well. The next ability on our list, Rack, has fundamentally weaker damage than all of our other magic abilities. However, it has the added effect of dealing double damage against stunned or bound enemies. When benefiting from this effect, it deals the same average damage as Dragon Breath, putting it on par with our strong basic abilities, and because of its very short cooldown, we can make some wonderful rotations using this effect. Unfortunately, most boss monsters are immune to both stuns and binds. However, if you're fighting something that isn't, click the card on screen now to head over to one of my other videos where we take a much more in-depth look at making stun rotations. The next ability on our list is Tuska's Wrath, which many of you are likely very familiar with. It deals an average of 70% of your ability damage, which means if you're not able to use flanking for impact, you can't hit multiple enemies with Chain, or you can't bind your target to use with Rack, then Tuska is the highest damage of these 5 choices. It also has the added benefit of dealing absolutely insane damage to most Slayer targets. However, if you're on a Slayer task, you definitely don't want to include this on your bar if you're using Revolution. Instead, you'd want it on a secondary bar or to click it from the book so you can make sure you always use it on a fresh enemy with high HP and get the full damage from it. If you just include it in your Revolution bar and let Revolution do its thing, chances are Revolution will frequently activate it while an enemy is already on relatively low HP and effectively waste the ability. Finally, the last of our 5 choices is the ability Sacrifice, which deals an average of 60% damage like most of the first abilities we talked about, with the added benefit of healing 25% of the damage you deal or 100% if the target's killed. This likely won't be a common choice ability, however, if you're still not able to benefit from the flanking switch, you can't hit multiple enemies with chain, and you're not able to benefit from the double damage on rack, then this is a good choice that's on par with all of those other abilities, but also has the added benefit of some free health. If you're already well acquainted with full manual, the easiest thing to do with these abilities is to put the 3 magic basics into those slots and put Tuska's Wrath and Sacrifice into an auxiliary bar, since we can use them with any attack style anyway. If we're strictly using Revolution, however, which abilities we choose to fill those remaining 3 slots is going to have a very large impact on our DPS, and it's going to change depending on the circumstances of the fight. Let's run through a couple hypothetical examples to make sure that you understand how the ability choice fits into those 3 slots depending on the different combat situation. First, let's say we're fighting Telos. Because Telos is always going to be focused on us, we're never going to be able to benefit from a flanking switch by running to the side or behind him to get increased damage from impact. Chain generally won't get boosted damage, however later in the fight when he starts summoning golems, it will be beneficial to use once or twice, so we'll probably put this in the last slot. Although Telos is stunnable and bindable, let's assume we're on a high enough enrage that he is frequently using freedom, and so we won't be able to benefit much from the boosted damage from rack, and so we'll want to get rid of that completely. With those things in mind, the order of the abilities that I'd put those 3 slots in is first Tuska's Wrath, followed by Sacrifice, followed by Chain. As a second example, let's say we're DPS at Yakimaru. If we have a flanking switch, that's by far the best choice, so I would definitely put Impact in that first slot. We're not going to benefit from the double damage on rack or much of the AoE effect of Chain, and so the next best choice is Tuska's Wrath since that deals slightly higher damage, and then finally in the last slot I would put Sacrifice. Hopefully those examples help illustrate the decision-making behind which abilities to put in those slots, and while it's not ideal to have to swap out some of your basics between different types of combat encounters, this is a necessity when using Revolution. As always, if your goal is to get better at PvM, I do highly recommend starting to learn full manual as soon as possible, so you can go with the much simpler option of just putting your magic basics in those slots and then putting Tuska's Wrath and Sacrifice on an auxiliary bar to use with all different styles. That's the end of our basic abilities, so let's move on and start taking a look at some of our thresholds. Our first ability is Wild Magic, which is wonderfully simple, has no special considerations whatsoever, and deals spectacular damage. In almost all circumstances, this will be your highest priority threshold. Our second threshold, Asphyxiate, is another super high damage ability that also stuns the enemy. It's also a channeled ability, which means that we will break the ability if we try to move or switch gear while we're using it. The only real thing to keep in mind when using this with Revolution is that, like some other channeled abilities, Asphyxiate causes Revolution to kind of derp out at the end of the channeling process and stall activating the next ability afterward. To see what I mean, let's take a look at a side-by-side video comparison. On the left, I'm activating the next ability right after the final hit from Asphyxiate goes through, and on the right side, I'm allowing Revolution to activate the next ability. As you can see, there's definitely a noticeable delay between the 2 video clips, and part of doing good DPS with Magic if you're using Revolution is learning to activate the ability that you use after Asphyxiate to prevent this unnecessary stall. If you're completely new to this, the timing can be a little bit tricky at first, but if you practice for a few minutes at Dummies, you should be able to get the hang of it in no time. Our next threshold ability, Smoke Tendrils, is very similar to Asphyxiate, however it is fundamentally worse in several ways. Firstly, this ability needs to be unlocked by completing the Dig Site quest. Like Asphyxiate, it's a channeled ability, which means it prohibits us from moving or switching without breaking the channeling process, however it deals less damage than Asphyxiate, and it also recoils some of that damage back to the player. Like Asphyxiate, it also causes Revolution to derp out at the end of the channeling process, and so if we're using it, we should definitely be activating the ability following it manually. For these reasons, Smoke Tendrils is one of our less commonly used thresholds, and we'll talk about circumstances where we would want to use this later in the video when we talk about planning a Sunshine rotation. Our next threshold ability, Detonate, is a very unconventional sort of channeled ability. Unlike other channeled abilities, it doesn't have a set duration, so while it does take 3 seconds to charge up to its full damage potential, you can hold on to that damage potential as you like and release it later on, which is great for bypassing some boss's reflect mechanics. It also deals its damage in an area of effect, either a 3x3 or 5x5 if you channeled it for that full 3 seconds, and so it's great for dealing damage against groups of enemies. Finally, the last interesting thing of note with Detonate is if we execute it properly, we can actually stack an auto attack on top of Detonate and dramatically increase the damage that it deals, at least against its primary target. The execution for this is simple, however the timing can be a little bit difficult, and the key is all in how we release our Detonate. We need to perform 3 actions in quick succession. First, we need to activate the spell that we intend to cast our auto attack with, either from our ability bar or by casting it from the magic spellbook, and then we need to release Detonate. Then following detonate, we'll activate whatever ability we intend to use after it, and we'll resume a normal ability rotation. The difficulty with timing comes from these first two steps. Activating the spell and releasing detonate both need to be done on exactly the same tick but stay in the same order. If you're too slow and they're not done on the same tick, then casting the auto attack is going to cancel channeling detonate and you lose out on the damage from detonate. If you mistakenly release detonate first, then you lose out on your ability to do the auto attack. I would definitely recommend you take some time at Dummies to get acquainted with doing this and executing it properly. When done properly, you should notice the damage from your auto attack, the damage from detonate, and damage from the ability that you used following detonate simultaneously. Finally, we come to our last threshold ability, Deep Impact, which is a relatively weak ability on its own. It does include a 3-second stun, which means if we're fighting a stunnable or bindable enemy, we can use this ability followed by Rack to boost the damage of Rack. However, the combination of those two abilities is still weak in comparison to most of your other thresholds. What makes this ability worthwhile is, like earlier in the video when we talked about a flanking switch for use with Impact, the damage for Deep Impact is increased by 45% with that flanking switch as well. This means in any kind of team situation where we're able to get onto the side of or behind our enemy, using Deep Impact alongside our flanking switch makes it our strongest threshold after Asphyxiate and Wild Magic. In situations where we can't benefit from the flanking switch, Deep Impact is rarely, if ever, useful. Finally, this brings us to our ultimate abilities, for which there are only two that are commonly useful. The first is by far the best. This is the ability Sunshine, which can be unlocked from completing the World Wakes quest. This creates an area on the ground for which, when the player is standing inside that area, increases their magic damage by 50% for 30 seconds. The Planted Feet perk also increases the duration of Sunshine by 25%, and so it's very common to have a switch weapon with the Planted Feet perk on it, just to use for using Sunshine and then to swap back to your primary weapon. Under almost all circumstances, your goal with your DPS rotation is to Sunshine as quickly and as often as possible. We'll talk about that in a little bit more depth later in the video when we look at guidelines for our long-term ability rotation. Finally, our last ultimate ability, Tsunami, is an interesting ability in that it's cast in a direction from the player rather than at a target. It hits all targets standing in front of the player in the cast direction, so it's great for dealing good area of effect damage. It also applies a passive effect that gives you an extra 10% adrenaline for critical hits, which is rarely useful, however can come in handy for some fancy ability rotations at bosses like Telos. So now that we understand our abilities, let's set up some guidelines to help us think about our long-term ability rotation. In the previous video, when we were talking about melee DPS basics, we had a set of thresholds that we wanted to use before we use our damage boosting ultimate and between using our damage boosting ultimates. However, Magic doesn't have any of these types of thresholds. Instead, there is one honorable mention, which is the Gothic Staff special attack that I'm sure you've seen or heard about people using. The special deals reasonably high damage and costs 25% of your adrenaline, and the real key here is that it applies a +2 affinity debuff to the enemy for 1 minute. Without getting too specific about how affinity works, it applies a debuff to the enemy that makes both you and anyone else attacking that same enemy more accurate, so on enemies with high defense that you have a reasonable chance to miss against, applying an affinity debuff is going to quite significantly increase your average damage. If you're fighting a very high defense enemy, then you'll want to incorporate the Gothic Staff special attack into your rotation very similarly to the way that we used Quake in our melee DPS rotation. You'll want to use it once while you're building up to 100% adrenaline before you use Sunshine for the first time, and then you'll want to periodically renew that affinity debuff roughly once per minute or by incorporating the Gothic Staff special attack between using Sunshines. Apart from using that special attack where applicable, our ultimate goal is to build to Sunshine as quickly as possible and use all of our high damaging thresholds within that Sunshine. When using the Planted Feet perk on a switch, we have enough time in that Sunshine duration to get both of our highest damage thresholds, Wild Magic and Asphyxiate, off twice, and then between them we'll fill in with some other thresholds depending on the circumstances. Normally we'd only be able to fit one extra threshold in between these, however if we're using the Asylum Surgeon's Ring or if we have the Impatient perk on our armor, we'll sometimes get lucky activations of those and be able to use more than just one. As a rule of thumb for deciding which thresholds to use between here, if we have the Flanking 3 switch, Deep Impact is definitely the strongest, followed by Detonate when using an auto attack, followed by Smoke Tendrils, followed by Deep Impact if we don't have a flanking switch. Finally, the very last thing we need to consider before we put this all together into a complete ability rotation is when and how we can use auto attacks as part of our rotation. The first opportunity is simply when engaging combat, and there are a few important reasons to do this. First, it gives us a little bit of damage and adrenaline right off the bat, but the most important thing is that this prevents a targeting glitch that can occasionally cause us not to gain adrenaline from using our first ability. This glitch can be really obnoxious, and so engaging combat with an auto attack is always an important part of starting your ability rotation and should be done with any attack style. Our second opportunity to slip auto attacks into our rotation comes anytime we use a non-attacking ability. Most defensive abilities fall into this category, but our damage boosting ultimate Sunshine is also not a directly attacking ability, which means that we'll also be able to slip an auto attack in when we use Sunshine. When we're using dual wield, these auto attacks will happen automatically. However, Magic has a specific advantage when using auto attacks with two-handed weapons. By putting our active spell on our action bar, we can manually cast auto attacks and cause them to go through a tick earlier than they would otherwise. This means that unlike other attack styles that require us to stall for an extra tick when using a defensive ability to get an auto attack to go through, by casting it manually from the bar, we can get them in the standard 3-tick global cooldown from those defensive abilities when using two-handed magic. This is another reason why two-handed magic is often stronger than dual-wield magic, and it also presents some pretty amazing opportunities for doing a strategy called 4-tick auto-attacking that involves switching weapons that we'll explore in a lot more depth in a future video. Finally, our last opportunity for slipping in auto attacks is when we're using the ability Detonate, which we've already covered earlier in the video. One last thing to consider when we're talking about auto-attacking with Magic is that Magic has access to the debuff spells. These can be used as part of our rotation in place of auto-attacks, and in particular the Vulnerability spell, which is on the standard Magic spellbook and increases the target's damage taken by 10% for 1 minute, is often a crucial part of dealing good DPS with Magic. If you're in a situation where you want to be using these debuff spells, you should try to insert them in places where you'd normally be using auto-attacks anyway as much as possible so they interfere with your ability rotation as little as possible. So now we have all the information we need to improvise an ability rotation. Our first order of business is simply to build Adrenaline by rotating our basics, assuming the leftmost available ability is our highest priority. In this clip I am using the Impact ability along with my flanking switch, but keep in mind if you're not using that, that's a much lower priority ability. I'm going to continue rotating along these guidelines until the first time that all of my high damaging basic abilities are on cooldown, and this is the first opportunity for me to switch and do the Gothic Staff special, assuming I'm in a situation where it's appropriate to get that affinity debuff. If we don't yet have the Gothic Staff unlocked, or we're fighting something with low defense that we already have a great hit chance against, we would simply skip this and just continue building Adrenaline following those basic ability guidelines until we reach 100% to use Sunshine. When we do use Sunshine, we'll want to make sure that we not only use the Ring of Vigor switch to save 10% Adrenaline, but also our Planted Feet switch to make sure that we extend the duration of Sunshine. After that, our objective is just to hammer out as much damage with thresholds as possible while the Sunshine buff is active. We'll start with Wild Magic, followed by Asphyxiate, and for the third threshold I'm choosing Deep Impact since I do have a flanking switch. We could replace that with Detonate or Smoke Tendrils instead if we don't have a flanking switch, or we could use several of them if we got lucky with the Asylum Surgeon's Ring. In this clip I didn't get lucky, so that's the only extra threshold I get to use before going back and using Wild Magic and Asphyxiate again. By the time the last hit of our second Asphyxiate goes through, the Sunshine buff will have expired, and so our objective swaps back to building Adrenaline again. If we're using the Gothic Staff special, now's a good time to renew that debuff, but otherwise we're just simply going to build back to 100%, and we'll find we actually get there before Sunshine comes back off cooldown. At this point we could use Onslaught, which is great against enemies with high defense, we could do a shield switch for Revenge if we're in an appropriate circumstance, or we could simply rotate some of our thresholds while we wait for Sunshine to come back off cooldown. Once we do have Sunshine back off cooldown, we'd simply use that and repeat this rotation. Thanks for watching, guys. If you feel like something was unclear or you have a question, drop it down in the comments section below and I'll do my best to answer that for you. Big thanks to God's Paladin, Mike, and Wumpery for their generous support on Patreon. Links are on screen or in the video description if you're feeling super generous and want to help support these videos as well. As always, a huge thank you to all of you guys for the feedback and support, and I'll see you guys in the next video.